I'm Robin Kelsey. I'm a member of the faculty in History of Art and Architecture here at Harvard, and I co-direct the Environment Forum with my colleague, Lucien Castaigne-Taylor, a filmmaker and anthropologist who is on leave and in Europe at the moment, so he can't be with us. The forum is so generously hosted by the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I'd like to thank Susie Clark and Steve Beal and Mary McKinnon and Charlotte Whitman and Julia Corso for making tonight possible. The support we've received from the Mahindra is tremendous. This event is also co-sponsored by the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, and I want to thank Jim Stock and his team for their ongoing support for these conversations. It shocks me to say it, but this is the 10th year of the Environment Forum, which I still think of as a new initiative, which says something about how long in the tooth I am. Ian Miller of the History Department and I launched the Environment Forum in 2016 in an effort to stimulate new conversations about our relationship to the Earth and its many inhabitants, and also conversations about how we might need to change the humanities in order to address the many environmental challenges of our time. And over the years, we've been privileged to have a remarkable array of speakers at this forum, including Richard Powers, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Betsy Colbert, Margaret Renkel, and wonderful locals, including Taya Miles and Michael Pollan. Our guest this evening is Michael Lobel, who is professor of art history at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. As an art historian myself, I am especially delighted to have him with us. In the 9+ years of the Environment Forum, he is in fact the very first art historian to speak here as a guest. So no one can accuse me of a pro-art history bias. On the contrary, it's about time. Michael splashed onto the art historical scene with his wonderful book, Image Duplicator, Roy Lichtenstein and the Emergence of Pop Art, which Yale published in 2002. He followed that up with James Rosenquist, Pop Art, Politics, and History in the 1960s, published by California in 2010. And then in 2014, he did another book with Yale, John Sloan, Drawing on Illustration, which won the Eldridge Prize from the Smithsonian American Art Museum for the year's outstanding book on American art. Tonight, Mike will be speaking about his most recent book, Van Gogh and the End of Nature. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do so. Before turning the podium over to Michael, I do want to say a few things of a more personal nature. Michael is an art historian who always leaves me seeing more than I saw before, even in works of art that I thought were quite familiar to me and which I long admired. In addition, he has a knack for always finding the item in the archives, the piece of evidence, the letter fragment, or the little editorial cartoon that is exactly what he needs to clinch his argument. And this combination of observational acuity and archival assiduousness is truly rare and something I deeply admire. Equally rare in my experience is his success in combining what one might think of as a hermeneutic verve with scholarly modesty. That is to say, he's always aiming to change our way of looking at artists that are very familiar and about which much has been written, but at the same time, he always respects the limits of historical reconstruction. And for the many students here this evening, I would just take note, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better model for the scholarly enterprise than Michael. The format tonight will be as follows. Michael will make a presentation, and then I will engage him up here in conversation, and then we will open things up for questions with all of you. A very simple and familiar format, but one that works very well in our experience. So with that, please join me in welcoming to the Environment Forum, Michael Lobel.
Thank you. Robin, thank you for that really wonderful and humbling introduction. I want to thank Robin for inviting me here this evening. I want to thank Mary McKinnon for arranging everything for the evening. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to listen to me present a little bit of my thoughts today on this artist. And as Robin said, a book I published last year, which attempts to think about this artist in a kind of different vein. I've done a number of book talks in the last year. And actually, this is a brand new slide. It's one I haven't used in one of these talks, but that I created for a class I recently taught. And I thought I would start out here because one of the things that's most been impressed on me in talking, first writing about this artist, but actually more definitively in talking to audiences like this one about this very well-known artist, is the heavy weight of the myths around him. So I was talking with a friend of mine, Alistair Wright, who teaches art history at Oxford a few weeks ago, and we were discussing Van Gogh and trying to come up with an equivalent artist who has become this much and this big, immense cultural figure. And we're hard-pressed to figure out any equivalent. And I thought it was a good place to start because I would like all of you to just think about that, even just approaching this artist, how, given the weight of his myths, by the way, just to clarify what we're looking at in top center, one of the recent digital Van Gogh immersive experiences. Doctor Who fans will recognize the center image, which is a much-loved episode of Doctor Who in which Vincent van Gogh appears. At the bottom, a photo of arguably his best-known work, The Starry Night at MoMA, and the crowds that are always gathered around it. And the eraser is self-explanatory. But also on the left, I've been thinking a lot about methodology around approaching this artist, and his letters are a very sticky kind of issue because we have this incredible body of writings by this artist. And the issue is they're very seductive for anyone who writes or wants to think about this artist because there's so much to choose from. But they also offer us the kind of illusion, I think, of direct access to the artist's mind and thinking. So I think they're a complicated body of material to deal with in any interpretation. So given that weight, I do want to share with all of you that this book I wrote is an attempt to rethink or approach this artist in different ways. I don't like when people read off PowerPoints, but I'm going to do it just for dramatic effect right now. These are the opening lines of my book. Every time I hear someone extolling Vincent van Gogh as the quintessential painter of nature, I feel like my head is going to explode. As you might imagine, given how the artist is generally viewed, this means I'm due for a near constant headache. Now, I just put this up quickly for two reasons. One, because I want to flag, as I was talking about with Robin earlier, that this book I really meant not just for a specialist audience in the field of art history, or even as an academic or scholarly book alone. I really wanted this book to reach out to a wider audience. And I know, like many of us, I've been thinking about the state of the world a lot in recent months and of the state of academia. And I feel it's important just for me. No one else has to join me on this, but it's very important for me to speak to wider audiences. And that's something I tried in the book to balance between really intense historical research and close looking and a voice, which is actually closer to my own, I think, than anything I've used before, but that speaks to a broader audience than I usually would have. But also, again, facing the weight of this artist's kind of mythic status, how one can kind of approach it and try to get people to kind of rethink it. This book came about a number of different ways. About 10 years ago, I became very interested in Van Gogh. I began looking at his work a lot. I began reading it a lot. And in some ways, this book, very simply, it comes out of my frustration at reading a lot of the literature and writing on this artist, and then actually looking at the works this artist produced and seeing what for me is a kind of uncomfortable distance between the actual works and what's said about them. So a perfect example, in 2015, 10 years ago, there was an exhibition called Van Gogh and Nature. Perhaps my book is a response to that exhibition. I'll leave you to figure it out. And in one of the essays in the catalog, the writer writes, in Pollard Willow, which is the image I'm showing you above, Van Gogh captured nature with a soul. Now, this is the type of language and the type of thing that's said about this artist repeatedly. And I have to say, as an art historian and kind of maybe a kind of dyspeptic art historian at this point, this kind of language and this kind of rhetoric around this artist started bothering me more and more. And I'll explain to you why. First of all, I'll ask some of you, if you want to, after my comments and Rob and I talk a little bit, what it would mean to capture nature with a soul in a picture. That would be step one. But two, once we begin, I'm showing you a detail of the upper third of that picture. And what we realize quite quickly is that this is a picture which is crammed full of details of a very modern scene, of a modern railway depot, telegraph lines, a smoking locomotive, and in fact, in the left-hand edge, a figure that Van Gogh himself in a letter described as a railway signalman. So very kind of modern industrial scene. Or here's another example, not from an exhibition context, but from a social media one. In December 2020, museums around the world created this hashtag, Under Van Gogh's Sky. And they used it, again, this is the classic language that's used around this artist over and over and over again. And they used it to post images on social media. And you can see they were kind of very conventionally recognizable as Van Gogh, typical Van Gogh paintings, the blue skies, the clouds, the pulsating sun as an orb above, the cypresses. These are what we come to expect. But because I'm someone who looks and tries to come up, as I teach my students, with a kind of adequate account of the things that artists make and leave for us, my retort was, well, that's Van Gogh's sky, and that's Van Gogh's sky, and that's Van Gogh's sky. The usefulness of these pictures are actually, they mark several different episodes in Van Gogh's career. This is when he's in The Hague in the early 1880s. This is a Paris scene. This is a scene in Arles in the south of France. And in fact, all of these are Van Gogh's sky or skies. And the book is basically a way for me to try to create an account of what we might think and how we might rethink how we understand this artist if we take into account that these are all images he made and that this is the world he was living in. And I'll just propose, I won't propose, I'll say very clearly, there's no, whether or not individual readers agree or disagree with particular readings I offer in the book, there's no question that the historical personage, Vincent van Gogh, lived through one of the most intense periods of industrialization, certainly in European history. He was born in 1853, he died in 1890, and arguably in world history. And basically, the proposal of the book is, what would it mean for us to take seriously that this artist who's continually celebrated as the painter of nature lived in that world? And in fact, I think what we come to understand, as you're already seeing here, is that in fact, nature, the term nature and images of what we'd think of as the natural world is often in his work relational. It's placed in relation to other elements which we might call modern or industrial. And so that's the origin of the book. I, at some point, came up with this thought that, it would be very interesting for most of the chapters, 4 of the 5 chapters, to use the 4 elements as their framing device. Because, of course, the 4 elements are usually seen as the most intensely condensed versions of what we think nature is. But what if I use them and, to use Missy Elliott's term, flipped it and reversed it, right? And use them actually to signal not nature, but industry. So, chapter 1, air, actually deals with smoke and air pollution in Van Gogh's world and his work. And I'll just point out, in relation to this painting I'm showing you here, this is a painting that Vincent van Gogh makes in his first months in Arles, in the south of France. Almost invariably in the written literature and exhibition catalogues and books on Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh's move to Arles in the south of France is seen, and this is a paraphrase, but sometimes it's almost a direct quote, is seen as his escape into nature. Between 1886 and 1888, he had been living in Paris. In February of 88, for various reasons, he decides to leave Paris, and he takes about 16-hour train ride to the south of France, to Arles. And this is regularly seen as his retreat into nature. But what we see, if we begin to take seriously these aspects of his work, is that, in fact, Vincent van Gogh himself recognized pictorially that Arles was already deeply industrialized, right? And so part of this book and part of the research and part of the thinking is just to ask people to look and see what's on offer in these pictures and how we begin to change our understanding of Vincent van Gogh's experience of and depiction of nature and natural elements in relation to the industrial world he was living in. I'll have a little bit more to say about this, but some of the smokestacks on the left belonged to Arles's gas works, which I'll get back to. But some of them belonged to a major industrial player in Arles. It was one of the biggest employers in Arles in this period, and that was the railway workshops. In order to actually build this train and maintain the railway tracks that got Vincent van Gogh from Paris to the south of France, there were massive railway workshops built in Arles decades earlier. And so in this chapter, I also talk about Van Gogh's entanglement with the railway and railroad travel. It was we would not have the Vincent van Gogh we know today without the very easy accessibility to a member of the middle classes like himself of railway travel. It was an important part of his life experience, and it makes itself felt and imaged in his work over and over and over again, for instance, in this Paris scene from the summer of 1887. But in the book, what I try to do is not only make the book and my argument about depictions of the industrial, I also try to show us places where it may have shaped Van Gogh's experience and his picturing in less evident ways. And that's the case. I chose this because I thought maybe some people in the room might have seen this exhibition. Unfortunately, I missed it. But it was at the MFA Boston up until just about a month or a month and a half ago. And here again, we come into contact with the kind of sentimentalized Van Gogh. And I'm sorry, I sound like such a grouch, I know, but I really do. My motivation is that I want this artist understood in a kind of fuller and more kind of what I think is a viable or workable kind of way. So why am I showing you this image? Well, a lot of the rhetoric around that show and around Joseph Roulin. So Joseph Roulin is known, and I'll point out the limits of that, as the kind of postman. He befriended Van Gogh in Arles, and Van Gogh made many, many, many portraits of Joseph, his wife, and his children. That was the genesis of the exhibition. And the relationship between Van Gogh and Roulin is often kind of described, in sentimental terms as this deep friendship, in emotional terms. And Roulin is known almost across the board as the postman, in part due to Van Gogh's own description of him as a facteur, as a kind of a mail carrier who went along a route. But in fact, Joseph Roulin was not a common mail carrier. He's what was called in French an entreposeur, who was a postal worker who worked at the railway station. He brokered between the railway and the postal service on land. And in fact, for me, he becomes a symbol of Van Gogh's entanglement with the railroads and railway travel. Whoops. And so I think that the many portraits that Van Gogh did of this figure should also be seen in relation to this artist's entanglement with railway travel. Chapter 1 is air. Chapter 2, earth. Not that life-giving, sustaining force we want it to be, but Van Gogh's interest in excavation, mining, and extraction. In fact, it's undeniable that one of Vincent van Gogh's most impactful kind of experiences during his lifetime, before becoming an artist, were the several years he spent in the Borinage, which was this Belgian coal mining region, which put him in one of the most polluted places at that time on Earth. And I'm showing you not a Van Gogh painting, but a painting by the Belgian artist Constantin Meunier, who made many, many images and sculptures of mines and miners. And in fact, that experience and that place makes itself felt in some of Vincent van Gogh's earliest works. Some of the earliest surviving drawings we have by Van Gogh are of, well, there's one of a coke factory in the Borinage, of the miners here. And in fact, in these pictures, what you often see are these large masses, which are not natural hills, but are what are called in French terrils, which are slag heaps or spoil tips. They're where the discarded remnants of the mining process and the coke smelting process were dumped, which gives us one of Vincent van Gogh's most important early pictures. This is a picture he makes after leaving the Borinage, but is a record or representation of his experience there, the bearers of the burden. You'll notice that for the son of a reverend, as Van Gogh was, it has religious meaning as well. But in the background, we have the terrils, the slag heaps or spoil tips. And I believe there were actual terms in French at this time used for the women who scavenged refuse from those slag heaps or spoil tips. This is an image, I'm pretty sure, of women who are bearing the burden of industrial waste. And in fact, I think that this is Van Gogh's response to an artist he knew and loved and thought about a great deal, Millet's The Gleaners, and a kind of industrial age version or update of Millet's scene. That interest, it would be one thing if those images and those interests only were anchored in Van Gogh's time in the Borinage, but in fact, for much of his career, you see him having interest not in the earth, again, as a sustaining, life-giving force, but as something that gets dug into, excavated, extracted by human intervention. There's one thing I want to say about this image. I love this image. I'm low-key obsessed with it. But after giving many of these talks, I've often had people come up and say, oh, a lot of the images you showed, I don't recognize. And I think that's partly because we, meaning those who write and those who curate Van Gogh, often make choices about what to keep in and also what to leave out. And I think images like this one, by the way, this is an image of an abandoned quarry. During much of his time in Paris, Van Gogh lived with his brother Theo on the hill of Montmartre. And this is sort of looking down the hill at this abandoned quarry across the way to these massively industrializing suburbs of Paris. And I just think this is an image that people don't see a lot because it doesn't fit in to the standard narrative of what is desired from this artist. Chapter 3, fire. You're probably not supposed to have favorite chapters, just like you're not supposed to have favorite children. But this is one of my favorites because it's one of the simplest. And what it does is track Van Gogh's interest in artificial illumination, and particularly in the form of gaslight. Now, gaslight might seem a kind of neutral subject, but it was also a product of the age of coal. Gaslight was powered by coal gas. And Van Gogh gets, in mid to late 1888, he gets very interested in gaslight. In fact, I propose in the book that this period in his career should be known as his gaslight period, because he is fascinated with this new form of artificial illumination. He's interested in how it may affect the painter's art, particularly in terms of color, but also in terms of how painters might depict night. And he does a series of works depicting the effects of gaslight. And one thing I noticed early on that eventually formed the kind of backbone of this chapter is that here again, Van Gogh is seeing illumination as relational. Over and over again, it's very curious. In each of these pictures, major pictures from this period, there are actually two paired forms, different forms of illumination. So let's point this out. One of Van Gogh's great works from this period, The Night Cafe, which lives at the Yale University Art Gallery. In fact, what you'll notice is there are actually two forms of illumination here. There are older oil lamps, hanging oil lamps down here, but above there's a fourth lamp that's totally different. I think this is one of the new forms of gas lamps. So at this point, gas light is pretty much established, but electric light is starting to come into use. And a lot of the gas lamp manufacturers were rolling out new forms of gas lamps to compete with electricity. We don't have electricity on offer here, just to clarify. So, and in fact, the gas lamp up here, I think, explains, and its newness in relation to the oil lamp actually may explain a formal element in this painting, which is the very, very clearly defined shadow under the billiards table. So again and again in this period, from the Night Cafe to Cafe Terrace by Night, which is, I think, seems to be Van Gogh's first painted rendition of a starry night. But if you look closely, it's easier to see when you're looking at the picture. This is a picture that lives at a fantastic modern museum, not much visited in the Netherlands, called the Kröller-Müller Museum. But if anyone ever visits the Netherlands and Amsterdam, I recommend a day trip out to the Kröller-Müller, which is in a national park in the Netherlands. But in fact, the stars above are being contrasted with what Van Gogh himself called in a letter, this immense gas lamp that's hanging out over the terrace. I like to I talk to my students about how sometimes the best interpretations are the simplest, even though my students tend to want the most complicated ones. And so I've seen very complicated interpretations of this picture. I would just point out what I find one of the most interesting aspects of it is the fact that Van Gogh has removed any figures from the foreground, even much of the midground of the scene. And in fact, what we get is an empty kind of scene with these tables and chairs that emphasizes the effect of gaslight itself on these elements. And finally, not the best known and most loved Starry Night, but a very important one on the way to it, the Starry Night over the Rhone. And what we're looking at is the river, the banks of the river, and then the stars above contrasted with these gas lamps along the banks that you can see here. And I point out in the book that what's interesting to me is that, again, well, first of all, sometimes I say I'm a contrarian, but I actually don't think I am. I think the readings in this book are very straightforward. And what I point out that for an artist who I keep being told was focused on the natural world, in fact, the only lights that are reflected in the river and that in fact are exaggerated are the gas lights, not the stars. I find that interesting, and I think Vincent van Gogh was thinking, as I've been showing you, very deeply and consistently about this new form of illumination, how it was impacting the painter's art, but also how it was impacting our visual experience. And I want to say that the book oftentimes tries to bring us up to the present. And of course, many of us recognize now that light pollution is a huge, huge, huge problem in our world. And I think Vincent van Gogh, and particularly this painting, is beginning to register what it means to have artificial, human forms of illumination competing with illumination from the natural world. Chapter 4, water, about water pollution, industrial water pollution. I look at images like this one of the Rubin du Roi, which was a canal in Arles. In fact, it ran very, very close to the famed Yellow House, which was Van Gogh's residence in Arles. These images can certainly support a pastoral reading, right? The sun in the sky above, the water running, we imagine, placidly along, although we don't know if it's placid, the green banks, right? But in fact, in the period, I love doing research. I was telling Robin earlier, I feel like a comfort right now for me is just immersing myself in research. And so for the book, I read a lot of newspaper accounts of Arles in this period. And again, the Rubin du Roi, which appears in Van Gogh's work repeatedly in this period, is described by one word in French, égout, which is sewer. This was a heavily polluted waterway. And in fact, Van Gogh himself helps mark that for us. It's visible in this painting, but in one of the major preliminary sketches Van Gogh does of the scene, one of the major polluters of this waterway was the town's gasworks. And that's what you're seeing here. So that there's actually very clear connection between gaslight, Van Gogh's interest in it, and a scene like this, which he absolutely knew. He actually talks about going out to the gasworks to pay his bill because he wanted gaslight in the Yellow House when Gauguin arrived. Speaking of Gauguin, another thing I get repeatedly when I've been talking about this book this past year, a member of the audience, I'm sure not one of you, but a member of the general public raises their hand afterwards and says, well, Vincent van Gogh just showed us these things like the smokestack and the gaswork because that was just what was there. He's just showing us what was there. This is a common thing art historians hear. I don't think any art historian would think that's how artworks get made. But the good thing is, my good fortune, is we have a counterexample that shows that Van Gogh was choosing to look at these elements. Because in the few problematic months when Paul Gauguin came to Arles and spent time with Van Gogh in the Yellow House. They drew and painted very often as a pair. And the really interesting thing is that when Gauguin makes images of that same setting, the Rubin du Roi, he always turns away from signs of industrial modernity. None of Gauguin's images of this setting show what Van Gogh is showing us here. So we have a really good, this is a wonderful kind of test case, right, for showing how a certain artist might choose to take things out of the work, and another artist may choose to actually keep those things included. And finally, moving on from the four elements, color. Not an investigation by me into color as a kind of naturally occurring aspect of the perceivable world, but in fact, color as a new industrial manifestation. Some other art historians, I want to give credit to an art historian, Laura Ann Kalba, who's written very interestingly about impressionist color and modern industry. The 19th century was a time of industrial color, and one of the main culprits or sources of it was something that was well known at the time, but that has receded for us, a group of colors called the coal tar colors. A residue of the industrial process of processing coal. Coal tar, scientists realized, could give us many, many different things, hydrocarbons. It became the source of aspirin and acetaminophen and TNT, but it became a source of many colors. Anyone who's interested in this subject, I think there's a whole book just on mauve and its origins as a coal tar color. And Vincent van Gogh himself was caught up in this interest in these new artificial colors, which were oftentimes not stable. And what am I showing you here? I'm showing you two versions of the same picture, one of Van Gogh's celebrated bedrooms. On the left is how that painting looks. It's the same painting. It lives in the Art Institute of Chicago. On the left is how it looks today, more or less. On the right is what conservators and conservation scientists have visualized it looked when Van Gogh painted it. Because Van Gogh he knew this. He used a new type of paint, a pigment called geranium lake, which was one of the coal tar colors. It was colored by eosin, which is one of the coal tar colors. And he knew, in fact, in Van Gogh's letters, he says very explicitly, I know geranium lake will fade, and that's why I need to use more of it. So even the very kind of intense pigmentation of some of Van Gogh's pictures may have been tied in part to his recognition of the ephemerality of these new artificial pigments. One of the last sections of the book talks about what I think is a remarkable and very interesting set of drawings that Van Gogh does on this high hill outside of Arles called Montmajour. And he goes up there and he uses a new type of purple ink that's also colored by a coal tar color called methyl violet. This is what one of these drawings looked like when it was photographed in the early 20th century. This is what it looks like today on the right. Here are two of those drawings. These drawings don't get shown because they're fading almost to nothing. And I say very, very sincerely at the end of the last full chapter of the book, I wish these drawings were as well known as The Starry Night, because they speak to Vincent van Gogh's embeddedness in the industrial modern world he lived in and worked in, and tell us about the limits of that world through the materials he was using at the time. As I said, I tried to bring repeatedly my discussion and the book's narrative up to the present. I'm sure more than a few of you are aware of a series of protests by the group Just Stop Oil, particularly very attention-getting one at the National Gallery in London in October of 2022, where these protesters, these activists, glued themselves to the wall and splashed tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers, which is glazed, so it was not damaged. But this got a lot of attention. There's a lot we could say about this. I think a lot of us might have differences about what we think about these forms of protest. I want to say just one thing about this protest, which is that at the time of the protest, I took note, I was finishing the book, and I took note of, or was close to finishing the book, I took note of something that was written in one of the newspaper accounts of the protest. A spokeswoman for the group said that they had chosen Van Gogh because of attention, that Van Gogh's sunflowers had nothing to do with climate change. This was simply an iconic painting by an iconic painter, and an attack on it would generate headlines. And I want to say to all of you, because of why we're here, and the issue of climate change and the climate crisis, I share many of the same concerns with this group and with the protesters. But I differ with them. In fact, this book is a kind of difference from that idea that Vincent van Gogh and his work have nothing to do with climate change. In fact, one of the main points of the book is this is an artist who I want to reclaim for the modern world. In fact, one of the earliest titles I had for the book was Van Gogh's Modernity, which I'm glad we moved away from that because it's too academic. I think this is an artist who tells us a great deal about the modern world, a great deal about developments in his own time that point forward to issues we are grappling with now. And that is one of the main things I would like to leave people with about this book. So thank you for listening. And maybe Robin and I might talk a little bit.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're definitely going to save time for audience questions because I know there are many people with good questions.
I imagine there are questions.
Audience.
Yes.
Yeah. But I do want to start things off. That was a wonderful account. I mean, having read your book and kind of curious as to how you were going to digest it, you did a wonderful job. I wanted to start off by asking how in this recognition of a kind of entanglement between Van Gogh's practice and industrialization in this moment, how you see his work positioning painting. In other words, to what extent, I mean, obviously, there's beautiful paradoxes you bring out about how he's using these industrial colors to represent the natural world with a certain kind of vividness. He's using the gas lights to paint outside so that he can represent the stars, right? There's all these wonderful paradoxes. And I'm just wondering if you could say more about how you feel the work is situating painting.
I think one of the things that has really become clear to me through the book, but then also after the book came out talking about it, is that for this artist, painting, but I would also include, I don't want to limit it to painting because one of my pet sort of thoughts is that Vincent van Gogh is misunderstood as a consummate painter. And in fact, I think most of the radical aspects of his art actually begin in drawing. But that would be another lecture. I mean, if everyone wants to stay 2 more hours, like I can talk about, because then you go back to, and again, I'm going to nerd out just for 30 seconds. But if you go back to The Hague and his drawing practice there, he's really starting to understand pictures, imaging in particular ways through drawing. That being said, he is an artist whose pictures very often place us. So there's a kind of placing, which is perfect for talking to this group and talking about the environment and climate. I think the best example on the upper right is the Montmartre quarry scene. And there it's very explicit, but it happens in many of these pictures. If you see in the kind of lower right that what looks like almost an outcropping or what have you, he very often includes elements in the work that kind of place the viewer within the work or give us a kind of anchor in the work. So I think for him, and I want to say this because one of the earliest responses to the book was by one of the world's foremost Van Gogh scholars who's been writing almost exclusively about Van Gogh for 30 or 35 years, and said, oh, this guy, Michael Lobel, is saying industry was more important to Vincent van Gogh than nature. I did not say that. I don't think I say that anywhere in the book. But I think what I'm trying to point out is that his work often does a lot of positioning and placing in relation to these different terms. So not only the viewer in relation to the painting and placing us in the picture, but then how figures in the picture are related. In the upper left, the factory scene, which is probably in Anières, one of the industrial suburbs of Paris. There are these two little figures in the picture who become kind of surrogates for us, who are related to both that kind of field of greenery and vegetation in the foreground and the industrial scene in back. So I think for one, and I think the effectiveness, we could go back to that photo of all of those people in front of the Starry Night, the effectiveness of this artist and the reason why I think his art has, is so captivating to so many people is the way it positions and places and locates. And partly what I'm trying to do is open that up to not just this more limited term or set of terms in terms of the natural world, but a wider spectrum of the world that I have another, I didn't choose it because I'm at Harvard, so I wanted to impress everyone. But if anyone knows the meme of Will Ferrell in Zoolander going, is everyone taking crazy pills? So, I show these pictures, and in some ways it's just this kind of idea of thinking, well, am I seeing things that aren't there? But actually they are there. And once we start looking, we see them repeatedly.
Yeah, I love in the book you use that notion of being gaslit.
Right?
Which is very funny given your attention to gaslighting in the book.
I don't want to exaggerate, but I do think, and again, this is something I could talk about for hours. I've thought a lot about the way, and I started with that one slide, all of the ways in which Van Gogh has seeped into the popular imagination. If I was pushed, I have some questions about current curatorial framings of this artist. I think that when this artist, Van Gogh, is put on exhibition, it's a money-making proposition. I get it, museums need to make money, but that often screens out aspects of the work that I think don't fit into that proposition.
Excellent. There's 3 different directions I want to go with your response, so I'm just going to go through each of them. The first is, you don't talk about chromolithography in the book. And I was thinking, especially when you were talking about the industrial colors that Van Gogh is using and the intensity, I just wondered if, and you also say quite rightly, and some of these pictures embody this, the extent to which Van Gogh was fascinated by the persistence of sort of pre-industrial forms of activity and so forth into the industrial moment, which got me thinking about painting.
Yep.
I was thinking about painting, and I take your point on drawing, but thinking about that as potentially like the horse-drawn cart, and he's contending with this, and chromolithography and all that. So that was Yeah.
No, I'm in total agreement. Absolutely. I think, so what Robin's talking about is that if you look again and again, these aren't good examples, but no, absolutely, actually. It's lower left. I'm an art historian. We have to work with images. Lower left. So what I talk about in the book is that Van Gogh very often stages a kind of, again, relationality or back and forth between old and new. So you have in the midground, you have this little horse and buggy, and then in the background, the train, which is, again, just for those who want me to keep defending my argument, that train is leaving off this plume of smoke that's oversized and stretches almost completely from one edge of the picture to the other. But I absolutely think, and he does this in many, many different instances. He does this with kind of early forms of bridge building. So there are these bridges and Arles he's interested in. I absolutely agree. I think he's thinking about painting as a potentially obsolescent form of image making and how that relates to all these other elements he's depicting. Absolutely. Yeah. I think almost any painter, modern painter is, well, not any, but many of them are thinking about this problem, obviously.
Yeah. I also, the second thread I wanted to pick up is I completely take your point, and it came through so beautifully in the book about the way that Van Gogh kind of carves out this space for you as a viewer. But increasingly through the book, I was seeing the way that that space was being hemmed in by these signs of industry.
Yeah.
And I thought that came through rather beautifully all the way through the book.
I think that's true, and I want to make clear, and I say it explicitly in the book, I don't want to, some people might come away thinking that Vincent van Gogh was a kind of proto-environmentalist. I think the record is much more complicated and mixed. Again, it's not a version ever, I think the public, and even sometimes the non-public, want clearer, more sort of black and white versions of artists. I think he had a much more mixed view of these things. And it wasn't always, oh, nature is wonderful and industry is encroaching and we have to protect nature. I think he had a very ambivalent and sometimes ambiguous relationship to modernization.
Yeah. I took that away too, in part through the letters that you quote in the book. Often he'll go from talking about all of the industrial encroachments to then just talking about it as a visual matter.
Right. Yeah. There are times he really aestheticizes the railroad, and industrial elements, which is, again, why he is the artist he has become, is because, but I sometimes, given looking in retrospect, I kind of want him to be, a clearer champion, and he doesn't always offer that.
Yeah.
Which is in the end what makes him, I think, more interesting.
Yeah, that's great. So then the other thread I wanted to pull out of this had to do with your mention of the museum world and why they kind of continue to ride this Van Gogh. And one of the things that you do in the book repeatedly is kind of prod curators, like I'd like to see curators do. And I was just curious if you could say a little bit more about your thoughts about the relationship between those of us who do this kind of work and the curatorial world, as well as conservationists. Because that one thing that's so beautiful about the instability of the pigments and the way that Van Gogh says, you got to make it even more vivid because it's going to fade, is what a conundrum for a conservator. So what do? Try to go back, try to restore the original, or like, what is it, 10 to 20 years of fading? Like, where's the perfect, moment?
You've asked, this is a difficult question. So I feel like,
you said you wanted to have fun.
Yes. Okay. You're having fun.
Yeah.
You're putting me in that. How do I want to put this? So I think curators, and I think there's some in the audience, like I feel like I'm going to piss people off, and I'm a middle child. I want everyone to get along, and I don't want to sound like a scold because I understand the pressures curators are under. But I've come up, it's not in the book, but I've come up sort of, as I've been thinking about this artist for a while, with this idea of the way this artist gets presented in exhibitions, I came up with this term, the Van Gogh industrial complex. And there's just this massive apparatus around how, and look, I'm not faulting curators, just the issue of loans and insurance. These are really difficult issues. However, I think if I was being really honest and straightforward, I think a lot of museums nowadays are being run by their sort of the gift shop and, advertising and publicity. And I'm seeing, I think it's different for university museums, but I'm seeing a good number of museums pulling away from engagement with academic scholarship. And I don't know the answer. I mean, my answer to is okay, come on, guys, let's mix it up and make things a little more complex. I think that, I'm not saying this happens across the board, but this artist, I think very often, because of the complexities of exhibiting and presenting his work, there is, I think, a tendency to fall back on some very kind of cliched and trite framings that the book kind of responds to.
Excellent. All right. I have more questions, but I think it would be good to open it up to the audience. And I can ask more questions if it seems appropriate. So please, yes.
Oh, thanks. I should probably start with a disclaimer that I am a curator, sitting next to another one, and I think surrounded by others. But actually, that's not what I necessarily wanted to engage with. But I'm sitting here also looking at the painting in the lower left-hand corner. And what I have is actually more of a comment than a question, because you sort of posed at the outset the question of sort of what other artist could we think about with this kind of mythic status, the notions around nature, and I would say also the incredible emphasis in the scholarship and in exhibitions on psychobiography. And I have one for you, maybe an obvious one to you already, but that is Edvard Munch.
Yep.
And having just co-curated an exhibition of Munch across the street at the Harvard Art Museum.
Congratulations.
I think it's the same with Edvard Munch, and that we don't tend to see the works that actually deal with the burgeoning industrialization in Norway at the turn of the last century. There are incredible paintings and works on paper related to railway expansion, just as you were pointing out with Van Gogh, and also laboring workers, actually those workers who are making possible that railway expansion across the country. And just a little plug, in case you're in town a little bit longer, tomorrow we will be installing Train Smoke by Edvard Munch in our galleries from 1910, one of several examples that he made of that motif. And it also has fading colors, which we are currently investigating to see, in Munch's case, what pigments he was using. And so this has brought this in alignment for me with Van Gogh as well. So I think it's maybe not a Van Gogh specific issue that you're pointing us towards.
And I feel like I want to gloss my comments or at least clarify them. I think I have many, many friends and colleagues who are curators. I think there's incredible work being done in the field in many different places and in many different ways. I'm thinking specifically, though, of Van Gogh. And as you say, Munch and artists like this. It's a really, I've taught at the Graduate Center a doctoral seminar called Art History and the Subject of Biography. And I think it's a really great set of, because we're at a university and students are here, it's a great set of methodological questions, like how, and that's why I hadn't done it before, but why I wanted to start out with that first image. It's a really interesting problem. How does one deal with an artist or artists for whom there's so much weight and what I would think of maybe as baggage that weighs heavily on how this art, if you're a curator, how people are going to view the works, how they approach them, and how one might kind of rework or redirect that in some ways. So I'm not blaming anyone, but I am saying it's actually a really interesting set of questions and problems, I think, for us to think about.
Great. Other question?
Thanks. I want to go back to where you began with an aspiration to have this work speak beyond the academy. And I'm curious about how you're going about that, because at some point you revealed that you were pitching today's talk to Harvard. So how do you speak to a larger audience, and how is it going?
It's going very well. I've been able to give talks at a lot of just museums to general audiences, so the Barnes Foundation and the Norton Simon out in California. And one of, I did at CUNY, so I teach at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, which are both parts of the City University of New York system. I did a conversation with an environmental scientist, Peter Grofman. And I was telling Robin earlier, again, I think partly just because of me, but partly because of the ambient historical circumstances we're living through right now, I'm sort of becoming a kind of cheesy evangelist for art history. And I think it's an extremely interesting and exciting discipline, but also one that has a natural kind of interface with a broader public, right? People, when I've given these broader audience talks, people want to come and hear about Vincent van Gogh. And I think, and particularly the pressures now being put on the humanities and the university, which I know people at this particular university are well aware of now, I feel I want to speak to more people. And I actually think there are audiences for us if we do that. So that's just something I wanted to do. And how did I do it? Well, I wrote the book in ways, and in a kind of language that I felt was open and sort of welcoming to a readership.
Yeah, it's an eminently readable book if you haven't read it. And I was struck by the fact that you said at the outset that you feel that the voice that you've developed for this book is actually closer to your own. And it's an interesting thing to see as a scholar, the way in which you develop this academic voice through graduate school and so forth, and then you have to unlearn it progressively, yeah?
So, and maybe I want to speak to the students in the room, because I'm doing at the Graduate Center, I'm doing a dissertation workshop right now with my doctoral students, and just this past Monday, we were talking, and what we do each week, 2 or 3 students submit sections from their dissertation in progress, and we read it several days in advance, and then give feedback during the sessions. It's amazing, because dissertation writing can be so isolating. But we started noticing that there are kind of repeated structures and tropes in their writing, like in this dissertation I will, or a very kind of oppositional, like, this is what the scholars did so far, this is what I'm doing to make it better. And I talked to them about how I learned a lot of this language, and much of the time since then, the decades since then, are me unlearning that. So part of it is functional, like if you have a dissertation advisor and they want you to write a certain way, you do it that way. But to the students, I want to say, I think the most important thing on a meta level is to understand the rules, just so you can get to the next point, but also understand yourself within the rules and when you might want to let them go. There are some people who say, F it, I'm not interested in the rules at all. I'm going to write this paper or dissertation how I want to. There are consequences for that, and we can talk about that as well. But I think it's really important for students particularly to recognize what the rules and conventions are, and then make a choice about how they want to conform or not to those rules.
Totally agree. Other questions? Yes.
Michael, thank you so much for that talk. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
I just want to say, as a witness to Michael's history as an academic, we were in graduate school together at Yale, 30 years ago now. But you, even then, I do think you were already breaking out of academic shackles. I vividly remember you one day in seminar saying, "What do we mean by theory?"
Right.
And no one could actually answer the question. So Michael has always had a way of kind of cutting through some of the jargon, at the very least. But anyway, my question for you has more to do with how, I'm curious about how you think Van Gogh, as an artist figure in the grand world of art history, has somehow escaped all of the sort of eco-critical attitudes that art historians have been looking at landscape with for many, many years. I mean, I'm an Americanist, and you never look at an American landscape painting without immediately pointing out the railroad and the stumps, and that's been part of the way art historians, at least academics, have thought about landscape of the 19th century for a very long time. So how is it that you had to write this book, I guess? Why did Van Gogh escape this?
So thank you for your question, and I appreciate it for several reasons. One, it gives me the opportunity to just say very clearly to the audience that, as you're saying, a good amount of what I'm doing isn't brand new, and the book repeatedly points out that there's very important work in the field of art history, both in American art, but particularly European art, that comes from an eco-critical perspective and looks at, and there's significant writing about Impressionism and industry from an eco-critical lens. But then we come back to this is a good question, why, right? And why it is, so again, and this is something I think about these things all the time, because even though I do want to break out of things, I think I may be coming to accept I just am a scholar and I like doing this. So I think I've thought about this a lot. Why, so I'm not a trained scholar in 19th century European art. Why did it take me to write this book? But more significantly, there's really been no significant academic writing, at least in Anglo-American art history, on Van Gogh. There hasn't really been a book for like 20 or 25 years. And in fact, arguably the most recent scholarly book in Anglo-American writing on Van Gogh was written by Deborah Silverman, who's not a trained art historian. This is a good question. It's an interesting question. Does it relate? Does the mythic status of this artist, has it made him kind of radioactive to serious art historical scholarship? It's possible. Or again, that Van Gogh industrial complex, that the kind of intense pressure of exhibitions and the way in which much of the writing on Van Gogh, actually in the last several decades, has been through exhibition catalogues. It's a really interesting, it's sort of like some kind of alchemical process that has made this artist, has made art historians avoid this artist. And I don't know exactly why. I'm happy to have a very long conversation about all the little factors, I think. But I'm sort of maybe hoping that maybe my book could redirect things a little bit and say, okay, what if, because there's so much more, if I could capture all of you for maybe 3 to 6 more hours, I would talk about Van Gogh's really interesting fascination with popular printed imagery. That I can teach a class on that, several classes on that, which relates to chromolithography, but also relates to transformations in printing, particularly around wood engraving. So there's a lot more to be said about this artist, and I'm curious to see what might happen. I would love to see it, and I would love to be I don't want someone to totally disagree with me, but I'd like to be disagreed with a little bit, I would love that.
And some of that interweaving of Van Gogh's practice and the popular press comes through in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple linchpins, really. There's of the L'Eclipse
Yep.
cartoon, and then that wonderful song in Punch
Yep.
about coal tar,
Yep.
which I really love.
No, he was someone who was deeply invested and engaged with popular culture.
Yeah, that comes through. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I had a question, like, with respect to how Van Gogh, like, depicted his skies, right? At the start, you showed when, on social media, like, all these, like, beautiful, like, depictions of his skies, and then later, you countered with, like, you showed them, like, a little bit more, grayed out and, like, toned out. Was there, like, a period in his life when, he was more colorful and I guess, like, maybe happier? Or was it, like, what was his transition from, and I guess, like, why did he transition from these more colorful and beautiful skies to these, like, more drab and, like, gray skies?
Well, I mean, actually, it's interesting because earlier, his sort of coloristic shift actually he gets more coloristic and more invested in sort of intense coloristic hues later on. And that's part of, I mean, getting back to Jennifer's question, this is, and I think what's unfortunate that academic scholarship is somewhat disengaged from him is that this is a fascinating artist. So that move is deeply tied to where he is in the world. And his move to these kind of vibrant colors is clearly tagged in part to his experience of sort of vanguard French painting in Paris when he's in Paris between 1886 to 1888. And this opens up a whole other aspect of Van Gogh. And I have at least 1 or 1.5 other Van Gogh books on my computer, but I need to figure out what to do with them. But in one of them I talk about, and this is another area I think really could use more work, is Van Gogh's politics. We know that he was aware of French politics in that period, but also we don't really think about him in this way, but he was an immigrant, right? And I think another part of his story that hasn't been fully told is the ways in which when he moves to Paris, he's from the Netherlands, he moves to Paris, he's immersed in the French art world, in part through his brother Theo, who's in the art market. I think he is also understanding modern French art through a lens of national identity as well. And that's also part of this story of him shifting how he depicts the world in coloristic terms. So there are all these different facets and all these ways of getting into him. And your question really points us to what were the factors and circumstances that led this artist to become what he became.
Great, yeah, question right here.
I realized as you were talking that I was taking in, without quite being aware of it, a formal element in all 4 of those images, which is the line or the kind of line going across the middle of the painting or kind of across the middle of the painting. And it emerged for me as something, I don't know how else to say it, emotional, that is related to the content of what you're saying, because it seems to me that in some way those lines are non-representational elements. And there's, well, I'm gonna stop and just ask you how you think about it, because I wouldn't have seen them if it hadn't been for your talk, but I'm not quite sure what I'm seeing.
So just you mean you're talking about the ways in which space is sort of divided and subdivided, or?
Right, and I'm saying there's an obvious kind of allegorical possibility there, between past and present, between rural and industrial and so on. But I feel that you've taken us beyond that and that there's something very powerful about those lines that defeats such readings.
No, I mean, I would say I think you're definitely on, not to make a pun, but on a path that I would agree with. I think that he is constructing and composing these pictures in particular ways that play, as I was kind of pointing out earlier, play certain elements off against one another. And I would just point out, I mean, the quarry image on the upper right, it's such a fascinating image because I have a long passage in the book on it because I think it's worth describing a lot. And what's interesting is, so there's the small Let me go back, actually, so we can look at it more closely, because why not? Okay. There's the small kind of tuft of vegetation in the immediate foreground. Then there's that gash of the quarry in sort of past it. Then what we're seeing is a newly laid out, what we're seeing is the metropolis of Paris weaving its way into these outlying areas, because that is the laying out of a street or probably boulevard with the newly planted trees. And in this period, Montmartre is sort of being woven into the urban fabric of Paris. And then farther on, I think this is just such a remarkable picture. And I just can't believe, I think there are very specific reasons it's not well known. And then that massive industrializing space of Paris. So this, I think you're absolutely right. I don't know about the details. We could discuss the details. But this is an artist who is certainly constructing space with an idea of how, well, first of all, how space is being transformed in his world, and then how he might use that to set up various relationships within the picture. I would just say, I mean, I think it's not super interesting, but this does go back to the question of how artists get exhibited. I think there are a number of reasons why this work isn't as well known as others, although I think it should be. One, its subject matter, I think, doesn't fit in with the standard conventional kind of framing of Van Gogh. Two, it's actually a very large work on paper. So those of you who know about museum practice know that works on paper oftentimes can only be exhibited for very short periods of time, and then they need to be put actually in the dark to rest. But finally, this picture is actually in a museum that's not really well known for Van Gogh works. It is in the Netherlands. It's at the Stedelijk Museum, which is literally right next door to the Van Gogh Museum. But because the Stedelijk is not known for collecting Van Gogh, this picture, I think, just doesn't get seen and exhibited as much.
Fabulous. We have time for a couple more questions. One here.
So one factoid that medical educators like to drop is that digoxin, which is a heart failure drug, has something called xanthopsia as a side effect, which causes yellow tinting. And they often talk about how Van Gogh was, in his later life, on digoxin, and that caused a change in the way he perceived and painted. I don't know if that is pop art history myth, or if there's some actual, is there something to that?
Can I say I don't know? Again, and it really is, one of the great joys of working on this project and this artist is just to kind of confront this massive body of interpretation of his work. And I would sort of, send back to you and everyone else how we try to understand this artist, that there's this constant kind of attempt to kind of explain, why do things look the way they do? Why might he have done that? And I do think it's curious, why is there such intense interest in this artist and his work? It really is interesting. So it's possible. There are many, many different interpretations of Van Gogh's illness and the impact on his art. And I honestly don't know how to digest them into a kind of interpretation that is clear or makes sense. So I know that may not be satisfying to you, but this is one of the many attempts to kind of come to an explanation for why this artist's work looks the way it does. Yeah.
All right, let's.
Hi, Dr. Lobel. I haven't
Hi.
seen you since Hunter.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. I was also wondering about some of the formal elements, maybe kind of building off of your point. I really didn't notice the horizontal line through the middle, and I'm still thinking about the slide that you were on previously with the 4 different.
Okay, we'll go. Even though it's tedious for me to do this, we'll do it. We'll do it. No, it's fine.
It's
fine.
hard manual labor. I was just I haven't read much about Van Gogh, and when I look at his works, I usually think of them as formalist, and I don't associate them with nature or anything like that. But I think it's because he affords the same type of brushstroke to anything that's organic or synthetic. It's like nothing has been not touched by man, or nothing is also yet not natural. And when I read the abstract for this talk or this book, I came expecting to maybe hear that back when Van Gogh was painting, they had a different idea of the natural that incorporated in some ways technology or something like that. And I guess I don't have any conclusions regarding that, but it is kind of interesting to me that they're all kind of reaching this medium where the natural is not distinguished from the technological simply by the formal means, and whatever, like there's no stroke that isn't afforded like a role as both something that represents something man-made or something synthetic or the organic, which I find fascinating.
So I'm gonna do something I shouldn't do, but I always have way too many images. And so, yes. So your question actually brings me to the introduction of the book, which I didn't really talk about, but in the introduction, I realized that I needed to think about the term nature. And so I talk extensively both about that term as maybe we use it, but then also kind of in a historical framework, and then think about Van Gogh's work in relation to that term, both as we understand it, but as it's dealt with kind of historically. And what I point out is that, in fact, what's oftentimes thought of as nature or natural elements in Van Gogh's work, and this is even lies outside of my reading, but you can work more broadly with this, is actually nature that's been cultivated or manipulated by human intervention. So, and I want to point out that the title of the book actually comes from a very important book by the environmentalist Bill McKibben called The End of Nature, which I think was published in 1989, which is really often seen, particularly among environmentalists and environmental activists, as one of the major early texts pointing us to a consideration of climate crisis and climate change. So you're absolutely right that we need to consider the term nature when we deal with this artist's work, and I tried to do that, and I think I did it in a relatively, for me, satisfactory way in the introduction, where I talk about the term both historically within environmentalist discourse, and then how we might, again, look at Van Gogh's work in relation to even just the language we use around these terms.
And with that, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.